Okay, so in the previous lecture, I introduced you to ACLs and I showed you how you can use ACLs to provide really fine-grained control over permissioning on an object level in Parse. And ACLs are quite useful, but you're specifying directly a set of users associated with an instance of an object, which, especially if your application becomes larger, becomes harder to manage. What's more typical in a lot of applications is that different users have different roles, and a role has a permission on an object. So roles provide a logical way of grouping users with common access privileges to your Parse data. So roles are just named objects that contain users and perhaps other roles. And any permission that you grant to a role is implicitly granted to its users as well as to the users of any role that it contains. So let's look at this example where we have an object and we want to specify an access control. We want to specify some permissions, or we want to restrict some of its access to this object, to this instance of a class. So what we would do, we would either use or create a role. Perhaps this role might be called administrators. We would then, one by one, add users who belong to this role. We would then link this role to an ACL. And just like before, we would then link this ACL to an object. So we might say, set write access to this role. So a really big advantage of this in the future is, let's imagine you try to implement this not with roles but with our previous ACL method where you would specify users directly linked to ACLs. Let's imagine then that another user comes along and you want to give that user permission on all of the posts on the platform. You would then have to load up every single object, load up all of the ACLs associated for every one of those objects and add that user in and then to that ACL list and then save all those objects back again. Kind of a really convoluted mechanism. With roles, what you can do is, let's say another user is added to your platform, that user is an administrator. All you do is load the administrator role, add that fourth user to that role, save the role. So now user 4 is automatically granted permission everywhere the role it's associated with is granted permission. So just a much more useful way of managing users, especially if your application is larger and especially if your application has clearly defined roles. Now let's go through an actual example. Let's go back into our JS bin. Now let's just actually for now comment out this code at the bottom. And let's create a function called create roles. So to create a role, at least through code, to create a role, I'm going to use a variable called role, and I'm going to call new parse.role, and I'm going to give it a name, administrator, or admin is a good name. And then I'm just going to call role.save, and it's just another object like any other object in Parse, so the save is going to return a promise. So at this point, all that we've done is we've created a role called admin, but that role doesn't have any users associated with it. So let's add the currently logged in user to that role. So to do that, we type role get users, so it gets the user list, and I want to add to that list. I'm going to call add. And then let's add the currently logged in user to that role. And again, let's save this role one more time. Now before I actually run this, there's one other thing that we need to set up. The role instance is actually just another class in Parse. So we need to set up security for the role instance as well, because if we set up a role called admin and we add users to it, by default this would be public read and public write. So then anybody else can then just load the admin role and add themselves to it and then have full access permission to whatever you specify the admin role as having permissions to do. So by default, the parse role has another parameter. So it expects another ACL. And in fact, it won't actually save. So if I ran role.save, it would error out because this second parameter is not optional, it's a mandatory parameter. So you need to specify who specifically has permission to read and write to the role object to be able to save the role object. It's never allowed to be in a public permission by default. You must specify some sort of access control list. Typically what we do is if we type our role ACL at the top, new parse ACL. So I'm going to set up this role ACL so that the public has read access to it, and just like before, I'm going to set it up so that the currently logged in user, which is currently me, has write access to it. Okay, because we still want to be able to add users and save that role. So if I didn't set up the write access, then no one would be able to save this, the add users to this role. So that's what we do. So we set up another role ACL. We then say when we save this role, anybody in the public can access it, but only I can write to it. And I then, when I save that role, I'm then going to start adding users to it by calling get users, which returns a relation. I'm then going to use the add function on relations to add different users to this particular role. Let's add a then here so we know it's all done. There we go. Now if I run, there we go, the role has now been created, YRM. So if I go to the parse dashboard, I then go in the role section, here we go. So this is the role that's been created. And you can see the role itself has an ACL, and this ACL is that the public can read it, but only this user, which is me, the currently logged in user, only this user can read or write to it. So only I currently can add other users to this role. And then if you go into the users column, you can see it's a relation. If I click on it, and you can see I've added myself, the currently logged in user, to this role. Okay. So what have I done? I've created a role. I've created a role called admin, and I've added a user to that role. So I've added an admin user to that role, and I've set it up so that no one else can edit this role apart from me. Okay, so it's pretty secure right now. Only I can edit this role, and only I can add other users to this role. So how do I use this role? How do I use this role when I want to secure other objects? So let's go back into our example. If I scroll down, and I'm going to uncomment main again. And instead of calling create roles, I'm going to call main instead. Okay, so just to make sure we're logged in. So how we do this is actually very, very simple. So if you remember before, I called set write access on a group ACL, and I specified a particular user. And I said this user has specifically got write access to this object. Well, we can use another function called set role write access, and I can provide it the name of the role that we created. If I've loaded up a role, an instance of a role, I can also just provide the instance of a role. But I think it makes much more sense just to provide the name of the role, because it makes it much clearer in your code really what you're doing. So what I'm saying here is very easy to read. I'm saying that only admin users, only users who are part of the admin role, have write access, and I'm setting that ACL on this object. And you can also specify set role read access as well, just the same as ways you could specify write access, but I'm just going to leave it as write access. So now if I hit clear and hit run again, okay, so now we've saved test object with ID LMT. So let's have a look at this test object LMT. So it's the top one, LMT. So if I look at the ACL, double click it, So you can see that we now have public set to read, which is as we expect, but also now we have this role here. So the admin role has read and write access. So that's it. That's how you can use roles in access control lists to really simplify the management of your permissions, especially if you've got a large number of users or you have users who fall into specific roles, into specific categories or types of users. But really, security with Parse involves implementing, well, all of the features I described. So it involves implementing, well, the security keys, which you have to implement, but I would just make sure that those keys are, well, don't make them too simple. Treat them like a password. Never, ever, ever share your master key with anybody else, or well, anybody you don't trust, and definitely don't put your master key in any JavaScript code which will be released to the public or made available to the public somehow. During development, switch on client class creation, so to make it easy to develop with. But really, by the time you go to production, switch off client class creation, just so that anybody who has access to the client code and the client app ID won't be then able to kind of create classes or change the schema of your platform. And then also use class level permissions to set up permissions on a high level across all of your classes. But the best thing to do is to use access control lists. So I've showed you how to use ACLs in two ways. One of them by directly specifying the users who have read or write access when you specify an ACL. Or the second method, the more, I think the better method, is to define roles, add users to roles, and then add roles to ACLs. But really, securing your Parse application properly involves implementing all four of those steps, but more importantly, just really having a good think about security.